Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next in our leadership lesson series. I'm very happy today to be joined by Tim Cadogan, the CEO of GoFundMe. Did I get the pronunciation right enough there?
You did. You absolutely crushed it, Jason. So really pleased to be here with you. And thanks so much for having me and our company on with you.
Of course, I'm gonna not bury the lead. You just told me right before we got started that Cadogan meant battle scowler
Yeah.
from days past, which I think is the absolute coolest meaning for a name that I've probably ever heard. So I don't know if everyone knew that, but that's going to be the lead of our interview here today. So for those of you that are joining us for the first time, thank you. For those of you that have joined us for so many more episodes, thank you for coming back. I'm Jason Nazar. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Comparably. We are an employee review platform to help make companies more transparent and understand company cultures. I'm a serial entrepreneur and have started and sold a couple different businesses, invested on the boards of lots of companies here in Southern California. And I've always had the pleasure of getting to learn from great CEOs and mentors, just like you, Tim. And so this is a series we've now been doing since the start of COVID, really to help folks out in their career. And what we talk about in this series is lots of different leadership lessons, if I knew then conversations. And it's always important to us to have companies and brands and leaders that are meaningful to us. And I couldn't think of a more meaningful brand right now with what so many folks are going through than GoFundMe. Obviously, this is a platform and a company and a website that so many folks know and have been meaningful in their lives and that they use to donate. But in your own words, Tim, how are you describing and talking about the business today?
Well, first, that's a very kind and generous introduction. A couple of ways of characterizing it. So GoFundMe is the largest fundraising platform in the world. And just to give you a sense to that scale, about $15 billion have been raised through the platform over the last decade. And that's come about 200 million donations. What does that really mean, though? What that means is we've created a place where people can come together and help each other. And that is an incredibly important thing. And you touched on COVID and having that as a place where people can help each other throughout COVID over the last year has been immensely important and a great honor for us to be able to provide that service. And now as we're coming out of COVID, albeit with fits and starts, clearly, not fully out yet, we're starting to see people go back to normal life and start to use GoFundMe for not just their needs, but their dreams as well. So that's the heart of what we are, a place where people can come together, help each other for whatever is important in their lives.
To me, one of the things that was so transformative when I first started seeing GoFundMe and donating to, different causes, it's just how it immediately personalized the giving aspect. And for me, at least, it would typically, other than regular donations I would make to issues that are important to me, like homelessness or education, there would be some big thing going on, a disaster in the world, or, trying to help prevent AIDS or cancer. But there was no real way before GoFundMe to, at scale, meaningfully help an individual. And all the people that are going through so many struggles and so many challenges, whether it's their health or a disaster or a death in their family. And I know there's a lot more that your platform does today, and I want to get to that in a second.
Yeah.
The thing that was immediately so emotionally resonating is how it just connected you to that personal story of what somebody was going through and made you feel like you could be a part of making their life a little bit better. And that was just so powerful for someone that was just on the giving side and hasn't even used it, been fortunate to not use it to say, hey, I need help here. I got to imagine that you hear that all the time from.
We do, and you hit on the heart of it, which is it's the directness of it, and it's the efficiency of it that you're asking for help for something very specific, and as a giver, you're connecting to that directly. And so, for example, if you look at the early stage of COVID, we had a lot of small businesses raising money to keep their employees compensated through those really tough times. Sometimes, many times, those campaigns were not necessarily organized by the business. They might have been by a really loyal customer. And what happens when you give to a GoFundMe is the recipient doesn't just receive money. Which is what you do receive when you say you get government aid or a bank loan. That's an institutional relationship. When you receive support through GoFundMe, you're receiving support from 10, 20, 30, 50, 150 individual people. And when you talk to someone who's run a fundraiser, almost without exception, they'll tell you they're so thrilled that they raised whatever it was, $1,000, $10,000, 50,000, but they always speak about how much it meant them that this group of people, some of whom they knew and some of whom they don't know, said, I'm going to step up, I'm going to help this person or this business or this charity or this cause. And it's that kind of emotional quotient alongside the financial part that's so powerful in that direct connection. And let's face it, like we need this, right? We need things that connect people in a positive way. There's a lot of tough stuff going on. There's a lot of challenges in everyone's lives, and the ability to do that and connect and feel good about it on both sides of it is so valuable and important.
And I know you brought up to me that sometimes people don't realize all the different ways in which GoFundMe's being used and how it's not just for these absolutely critical disaster-like moments. Can you talk about a number more of those instances that are evolving now?
Oh, yes. I mean, of course, the more dramatic cases are often the ones that get the press coverage because that's the way media works, right? But there are so many different situations. To give you some examples, there are folks who have got into great colleges, but don't have the money to get into those colleges, and they're mobilizing support for their extended family, their friends, their community, and strangers to say, "Wow, this person's so deserving. Let's help them go to college." Right. That's a use case that we see increasingly. Another example, I love these projects around, say, community gardens, right, where people have put together a community effort to get more fruit and veg in their community, right? And this is particularly important in lower income communities that tend to be somewhat food deserts and aren't well served. And great efforts there. I actually have an example of a lady in New Orleans called Ashley Webb Barcello, who did exactly that. So, there was just a real paucity of fruit and veg, found a spare lot, put together a community garden, got the community involved, helped raise some money on GoFundMe, and they're doing something wonderful. It's bringing people together in a productive way. It just goes on from there, right? But those are a couple of those that we're seeing. And we really want to encourage that because it works and it brings people together and it results in great outcomes. And it's just wonderful to see.
What's been one of the most surprising campaigns you've ever seen that popped up that you might have not ever imagined that that's how someone would have used GoFundMe for?
Oh, well, I mean, one that I don't know if it's surprising, but just it really struck me was there was what became a very big campaign on behalf of the Navajo Nation during COVID. And what was really fascinating about it was you started to see a lot of contributions from Ireland. And this sort of unraveled a 150-year history of relationship between the Irish and the Navajo Nation. During the Irish potato famine, the Navajo actually contributed to help with the situation. And Ireland remembered that. And so this amazing kind of multi-layered campaign and these, long period of history and this relationship kind of bubbled back up again through this, which was just wonderful to see that, these kind of ripple effects that flow through.
Yeah. And you joined as CEO not too long ago, right?
I joined on March the 2nd, 2020, which is not that long ago in time, but it feels like a very long time ago in experience. Obviously, that was just as COVID really started to hit worldwide. And it was, a very intense start to learning a new business and getting to know people. I had 4.5 days to meet people, and then we went remote at the end of that week. And so there was a lot of stuff going on. But we really very quickly realized that we had an important role to play in this crisis. And it was all about how do we scale up and step up and do everything we can to help as many people as possible get the help they needed.
Yeah. So I've only been in the position so far of, running a company that I've started. I haven't stepped in to be a CEO of an existing organization. Obviously, with a brand like GoFundMe, that's a lot of responsibility. And so one of the things I've always been curious about is as you've stepped into companies in an executive role and a CEO role, what's the process that you go through, in that first 90 days where you say, well, here's what the company's doing that's amazing. How do we double down and lean in on that? And here are all these opportunities that maybe weren't focused on as much before. Can you give us a little bit of insight into both your thinking, but also your process there as well?
Yeah. Well, and one thing is I had a plan coming in that was very heavily focused on learning and being a custodian of what already was in place, not screwing up all the good things and taking my time. As mentioned with COVID and the crisis, a good chunk of that plan sort of had to be modified. But I created something I called the open source curriculum, which is I drafted a Google Doc with all the different topics I thought I needed to be taught about, and let the team add what they thought, and then essentially ask people to volunteer who's an expert in all these different topics and come and teach me. Like, tell me what you know, and I'm going to listen. I'm going to be the student. And we set that up, and it took a little longer than originally planned because we were in crisis ops, right? But really taking the time to get through that curriculum and to listen and to learn and do all of that was incredibly important. And then learning through those particularly the first 2 or 3 months of COVID, what this company could do, how far it could stretch, and what it meant in the world, and having that demonstrated in really the most intense way possible. That also sort of expanded my sort of mindset around what is our role in the world? Why are we here? It sort of triply reiterated that. So those were the two things. And then, so it was that learning plan modified. It was just absorbing the experience we were going through and then taking all of that and sort of thinking through, okay, what are the things that we kind of want to add on to what we're doing? How do we want to evolve the company? And doing that very thoughtfully, respectively, and inclusively, like involving a good set of people in that process. Those were the keys.
And what do you find is the most difficult thing about stepping into a new CEO role? Even with all the experience and background that you have, what's the most challenging part of that process?
Well, I've only done it once, and this once time was a very unique time. So I'm trying to, in terms of your specific question, I think it's working out where to go for change at what pace is probably the hardest thing. And I found it probably harder than I would have done because I wasn't able to meet people. I met most folks maybe once or twice, right? And so particularly when you're making change that involves, say, someone's role or an organization, there's a lot that goes into being in a room with them and reading the body language and the cues and just sort of working it through together, and having to do all of that on video conference and to sort of read the tells and the body language and those very subtle non-verbal cues about how is this going to work and where do I need to push and where do I need to pull back. That was hard. That was hard, but I think it's doable. And you just need to be a little bit more patient and take a bit more time than you might have done if you were in person in that situation. But so that sort of that where to push for change at what rate, and not to take on too many different things at one time.
Yeah. You brought up something that I think a lot about. I hear stories from a lot of CEOs and executives of how they haven't met even many of their direct reports on the executive team sometimes. And, I think you bring up this idea of how important trust is in a working relationship. This idea that there's folks that you're working with now at GoFundMe that you've probably never met in person. And
That's
I know
right.
that's the case for me here at Comparably and for so many of us. And there's just a certain level of trust and work intimacy, appropriate work intimacy, that you build up in an in-person environment. And you talked about this idea of, on a screen trying to look at verbal cues and see how things are going. How are you trying to think through and addressing the fact that there's certain work bonds that aren't formed as strong or as quickly when you just work over a screen with folks, and how to try to manage against that in the best way possible?
Yeah. Well, two things maybe to note on that. I think one is that in an interesting kind of way, this way of working forces you to be a bit more explicit about what's on your mind, and sort of get the cards on the table, because you can't do this sort of implicit reading that we're talking about. So in one way, that's actually sort of good, because you're moving out of making assumptions to try to make things explicit, and the reason we as people tend not to do that as much is it's always can be a little uncomfortable, right? So you sort of rely on your reading of the situation versus kind of laying it out. So I think that's one thing, and in a way that's sort of beneficial. The other thing is the virtual work in a way pushes us to more pure intellectual collaboration, right? So what I mean by that is because the ways of communicating are narrower, you're really getting to focus more on knowing someone's mind, because that's really all you have, right? You don't have the other stuff, right? It's sort of wrapped around semi-social stuff, hanging out, getting a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and shooting the shit or in the buffers of a meeting, right? You don't have any of that stuff, right? So it's much more like, what is this person thinking? What am I thinking? How do those connect? Where do they overlap? Where are we missing each other? So, example, I'm a huge fan of Google Docs, right? And I use that a lot. And I like to think of it used well as it's a way to do a mind meld, right? You put what's in your mind in a piece of paper that's shared. The folks you're working with do the same, and you kind of make that better by collaborating very intensely and intentionally and specifically, and hopefully get therefore to a better result. So I think you have to look at it as, yes, we have lost some things, but you can't dwell on those. You have to look, well, what are we gaining, right? What can we actually do better? And the other thing is, in a way, being virtual is the great leveler. Everyone is this little box on the screen, and everyone's voice carries the same. So, for example, in the old days, you'd have 6 people in the meeting and 2 on the phone. And really, those 2 on the phone were kind of hosed, right? Is the truth. They just couldn't contribute in the same way. It's just very difficult, even if they could hear everything clearly. And now we're all the same. So there are some good things about that, right? So I think it's just like, hey, this is a situation. Let's embrace the good things, acknowledge that not everything's like what it was, and go for it.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go back in time here a little bit. And so I want to focus on you and your career. When you were a young person overseas, what were your ambitions? Did you think about, wanting to get onto the business side? What drove you, and what were your ambitions as you were going through college, and where did you start off your career?
Oh gosh, I'd say my ambitions were inarticulate. In college, to be blunt, the reason I did a second degree is I wasn't clear that there was anything. I was like, just not that excited by my perception of what's available, right? Remember, I come from a rural county in Dorset. I had no exposure really to any of these worlds that we're in right now. So my just understanding of what was out there was small, but I had a lot of intellectual interest in topics, so I kind of pursued that through a second degree, right? And then I was like, okay, I don't want to write a book that 10 people read that sits in the library. I just want to do something a little bit more practical than that. So I better get a job, right? And I wanted to get something that's interesting that kind of educates me quickly about a lot of different things, which is what led me to consulting, right? Because that's, it's a role where you quickly get exposed to a lot of different kinds of industries and businesses and ways of thinking. So it's sort of like having, in 2 years, it's kind of like you have 10 jobs, right? And I think it's a very, very difficult thing for anyone in high school, college, working out what you want to do for a job. So hard because you don't really know what these jobs entail. And you have to make these big decisions like, oh, I'm going to go and do this and commit to that for a few years normally without really getting tested out. I mean, maybe you get an internship. So in a way, our sort of way of connecting people to jobs at that first stage of their career is horribly inefficient. Right? It's not a very good matchmaking system at all. And so effectively people make these leaps, right? Based on their intuition and often just a bit of luck, right? So in my case, like, well, I'll make the leap, but I'll make the leap into something that's diversified, right? So I ended up working all kinds of, airlines, insurance, car distribution. My first project was a cement company, which was a real eye-opener, like heavy industry, hardcore, pretty traditional, all kinds of stuff, right? But a great way to learn about the mechanics of a business, how P&L works, how different pieces work, how different cultures work. So it was good. I still, when people ask me, I'm like, I'd recommend that as a first job, is to, try a lot of different things pretty quick.
Yeah. All right. So the time machine question: if you could take a time machine back into your 20s, what professional advice are you giving yourself and why?
To be a bit more patient. I was very impatient as a young man. And I think I've learned that, to be more patient and to sort of let things think in and consider them a little bit more carefully before leaping to a conclusion. That's definitely helps. And then I think the other one is more about a sort of looking at industries, look for power curves, and some people call those, tailwinds, whatever metaphor you want to use, but be aware of and look for the trends in society that have power and staying power. And think about putting yourself in industries that are going to benefit from those. And don't put yourself in industries that's tacking up wind, because you can be, frankly, absolutely brilliant and it still make very heavy work of it if you're tacking up wind. It's just hard work. So put your talent in a position where you can catch the wind. I think those are probably the two things. In my case, I got, without really being as thoughtful as that about it, got lucky and got myself into a power trend, which was search, which became a huge power trend and continues to be to this day. And was very fortunate to get in really early to a great company that created the paid search model, right? GoTo, which became Overture, which invented it. And that was an amazing experience and still a standout experience for me.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. I think you bring up something so important, and especially, people are in very different situations. And obviously there's a whole bunch of folks that are just doing their best to kind of get any job and get by. And that's an unbelievably challenging situation to be in. And then there's a lot of folks that are lucky enough to have a lot of choices in their career, especially right now, even if they're in an early stage. And I always try to remind people, be a little bit less focused on what's probably number one on your list, which is whatever's going to pay me the most, and just be willing to make a little bit of a trade-off there, not a huge one, but a little bit of a trade-off for what you just said. Like, are you going into an industry and in a company that is taking off? Because if you get in something like that early, it's
Mhm.
just a massively important experience for your career. And who are
Yeah.
you making a bet on? Who are the people that you're going to work for? And do you believe in them? And I think sometimes um, we miss the forest for the trees in the decisions we make in our career. And it's whatever comes in as an offer and maybe pays us the most amount of money, instead of saying, well, I've got a long career in front of me. And if, as you
Mhm.
said, I love that phrase, I actually haven't heard it before. If I put myself in a power curve with great people, then I'm just going to be part of this massive benefit that happens over the next 3, 5, 10 years. And so many folks that I know have gotten so far in their career because they put themselves in those situations.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I always think of this trifecta. Where do you choose to work? You choose to work for people, you choose to work for interest, and you choose to work for money. I mean, that sort of boils it down, right? And ideally, you're hitting all three, but to your point, you have to make some trade-offs. And I think I very much agree with you. Like if you're trading, work for interest and these long-term trends and people over near-term optimization. Um, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. To stay on Overture for a moment, one of the things I think a lot of folks don't know is Google was not the one that invented the paid search model. Probably the single most to this day successful and profitable advertising model in business ever invented was that everybody globally on the planet goes and searches for things every single day that they are trying to find information on, or a service or a product that they need, and to put contextual ads against those searches. And that was invented by the folks at Overture. What was it like to be part of that business at that time?
It was frankly amazing. I mean, so a little bit of just one story. When we first started it, again, look, I was a product manager, right? So I'm kind of middle of the pile. I was just privileged to be part of it. When the company started, they were faced a lot of skepticism. The idea that you could put paid links in search and do it well and do it with consumer relevance was really sort of negatively viewed. Never forget a review by Walt Mossberg, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, that just panned it. And for a couple of years there, it was just like, this is a terrible idea. It's never going to work. It's sort of amoral to have advertising in search. Then the 2001 happened, dot-com bust. And so all the advertising on the web had been about throwing big dollars, banner campaigns, even people paying warrants for their advertising. Remember all that stuff, right? Kind of crazy stuff. The market explodes. And then suddenly it's like, oh, the real laws of business physics are back, which is you got to make money. You got to spend money in a way it's going to generate a return. The fundamentals. And suddenly, investing in an advertising vehicle that demonstrated a return was the hottest thing ever. Which, like, hey, I can put $10 into paid search ads and I can make $35 in sales. Boom. And then boom, off it goes. And kind of being part of a company that stood its ground in the face of that negativity at first and stuck to its guns and said, what we are working on has the right fundamentals, and powered through that and was ready to take advantage of the market, realizing, oh, wow, actually, this is a really good idea. And then making sure the model evolved to deliver good consumer relevance was really fascinating. Now, the second part of the story, or the third part related to Act 3, is Google. So Google, initially swore blind they would never do this, right? That they would only have ads on the right. This was terrible. They would never do that. And then I think they came to the same realization, well, we got to make money, right? And we can probably do this in a good way. So they embraced it. Long story here, lawsuit involved, all this kind of stuff. Let's not go into that. And they had one huge advantage. This is a little bit my point about power trends. They had a destination search engine. They had a brand. They had a place that people went. Overture's big strategic weakness was it as a distributed model. So it applied its engine through Yahoo, through Microsoft, through AOL, which most people barely remember at this point. And so meant that the economics of Overture were always a rev share, whereas Google had a destination site where they kept 100% of the revenue. And they could then use that to cross-subsidize their distribution deals, which they did. So over time, they could become very aggressive in securing the distribution deals, at points paying over 100% revenue share, which of course you can't say no to. And that created a network effect of more supply, more searches, fueling an advantage that ultimately was not possible to compete with.
I'm curious to get your take and perspective, because I think there are a lot of founders and CEOs that I know, and a lot of folks in the workforce that have come up in the last 10 years, which means, with the exception of a couple months for COVID, because for a lot of tech companies, COVID actually turned out to be a benefit after the immediate dip. They've seen nothing but up and to the right, for their whole career. And it colors your decision making. And I will absolutely say, I think there is a boldness and aggressiveness and distortion reality field that is attributed in a positive way to folks like Steve Jobs, that a group of folks have that I may not. And I always find it interesting to talk to other founders and folks in tech that both lived through the original .com bubble and then obviously '08, and just how it makes you think about growing businesses and taking risks, because you've lived through more cycles. And right, everything at some point will change. It's a pendulum. Obviously, the stock market's at an all-time high right now. There's never been more money in venture capital and private equity than there is at the moment. It's never been harder to hire and retain talent than it is at the moment. And so how do you think about growing a brand like GoFundMe, also having lived through these other two meaningful moments where things did not turn out so well for companies that were high flying?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be aware that there are a whole set of risks that you don't have as much control over as you think. That said, you have to go for it in exactly the same way, which is you have to try and take your lessons, right, from what you've seen, put good people around you in the exec team and the board and benefit from their lessons, and shape a strategy that you believe is true to the company and drive a lot of growth. And be aware that you can get hit, right? Stuff can come at you pretty quickly. And, usually when it comes at you, it's not anticipated. Otherwise, you would have had a plan, right? So I think you just have to know that your plan might have to change really, really quickly, and be ready for that, and accept that that's actually the normal state of affairs in business. And it's, don't expect that you're going to have this smooth ride. That's super abnormal. It has happened, right? As you mentioned, we've seen a bunch of companies, partly through good decisions, but partly through some good fortune as well, have just had untraveled growth, right? But that is not the norm. The norm is some battling, some clear water, some battling in more choppy water, and then some more clear water. That's the norm. And so just be ready for that. But I don't think you should ever let that temper your ambition. You just need to be ready to take some shots.
Yeah, well said. All right, so one more time machine question. If you could take the time machine now back into your 30s, what either professional or personal advice do you give yourself, and why?
Oh, my 30s. I'd still advise myself to be patient, because I still haven't progressed enough on that side of things. But I think that is a time to really start thinking about what it is you want to be doing longer term. Because I think if you've used your 20s and some of your 30s and had a good range of experience, you should be getting to know yourself reasonably well as a professional. Hopefully you know yourself pretty well as a person, but kind of getting a sense of, truthfully, what am I good at and what am I not good at? And what is it that I could be good at? And what is it that I could just, I'd love to be good at it, but just not my strength. Let's say you're really, really, really a great communicator, but you're not super technical, and you tell yourself, I want to be a computer scientist, I want to be a software programmer. It's like, that's not you, right? So you should know now, like, these are my strengths and weaknesses. And this is what makes me feel good about coming in and working on something. And so what do I want to harness that to? And that doesn't have to be an immediate thing, but starting to think through, what's that path? So just take my example. I'm at Yahoo, I'm, running a bunch of stuff there, enjoying it, but in my later 30s, starting to realize I would like to go back and do a startup. And this time I'd like to run the startup and just have that whole experience. And that became clearer over time. Like, I did want to go and do that. Some of those, you're definitely aware, like, that is going to be a hard road, right? Given the things that I'd seen, like, hey, it's probably not just going to be like, boom, everything's good. It's going to be a lot of adversity. Am I ready for that? Do I think that I can take that and manage through it and stay steady? And sort of understanding yourself and beginning to make your longer arc choices is probably what you want to be thinking about.
And what did you find that you were best at? What did you self-identify that you were really good at, and how did you leverage that to move farther along in your career than a lot of other folks could have?
Oh, I hate answering that question because it sounds really. I think I'm decent at formulating and articulating a strategy and communicating clearly what it is that we're trying to do. And I think, if you want to run a company, there's a few key things you need, but I think one of them is you need to be able to paint a clear and exciting picture of the future. Otherwise, who's going to join you? Like, if you can't do that, you just like, that's the start, right? I think we want to go and create this, and this is why this is exciting. That's step one. Really, in any good company, for people to want to come and like, yeah, I do think that's exciting. I want to join you and help create that, right? So that, I think, was one. I think two was I'm kind of okay at a lot of things, right? And so for a CEO, and you have the exact same experience, early stage, you just got to be doing a lot of stuff, right? So I remember one day early at OpenX, which was the startup, someone asked me, I was interviewing, like, well, what's an example of the sort of things you do? And I'm like, well, sorry for the graphic nature of this. When I first came in this morning, someone had not really flushed the toilet properly, so I plunged the toilet. We had one toilet. So that's how the day started, just so everyone else could come in, have a decent bathroom experience. And then just before I met you, I've been working on our 3-year strategy and plan. So pretty much everything in between, from plunging the toilet to strategy. So, you got to be able to do a bunch of different things. And then maybe the third one is, not losing your mind when things do go sideways, and being able to stay reasonably calm, because stuff is going to get messed up. It's just going to happen, and you just got to be calm.
Yeah.
Reasonably calm.
To that point, I think you've identified both in your 20s and 30s, one of the areas that you want to get better at is patience. It's a double-edged sword, because part of what I think helps folks in companies in our stages and size keep getting is that we have these high bars and maybe sometimes what other people might think of as unrealistic goals. And so it's hard sometimes, I think, to know when to be patient and when to be unrealistic compared to other people as far as how fast and how far you can go. That said, what do you identify today as the areas that you're still trying to get better at patience? What are the examples in a workplace environment that you say to yourself, I wish I had been more patient then, I wish I'm going to focus on being more patient here because it's going to be for the benefit of everybody involved?
Yeah, but I have a little saying that I talk about being reasonably unreasonable. And so to your point, anyone who builds anything significant, doesn't have to be a company, can be a civil engineering project, can be something in the government, a charity, you name it. You have to be a little bit unreasonable, right? Because you're fighting against inertia, right? You're fighting against the status quo, and you're wanting to create something new, and that requires inherent unreasonableness. There's a wonderful, I think it's Oscar Wilde quote about how progress belongs to the unreasonable man. I'll send you the quote. It's really good. But to your point, you've got to temper that, because if you're just crazy unreasonable, then it's not credible, right? It's just too hard for people to make that leap. Now, there are a few very rare people who can pull that off. Mm-hmm. But in most cases, some amount of tempering, some amount of reasonableness is there. So in my case, I guess now it's, I'm trying to expand our perception and our community's perception of the role that GoFundMe can play in people's lives. Because I think it has got this very powerful positive effect. And I would love for that to be more broadly experienced. And so I think it's working out how to prosecute that ambition while not doing it finding the appropriate pace, probably is the ongoing project.
Switching back to GoFundMe for a moment, one of the things I've always been curious about in your product experience is do you have, or is it on the roadmap? Are you thinking about some kind of ongoing contribution subscription offering? Like, one of the businesses that I find really interesting is Patron, and how it's helping to support a lot of creatives and artists by basically saying, hey, we're going to donate $100, $500, $1,000 a month because we love what you do and we want you to just keep doing it, which obviously is a little bit of a different value proposition than GoFundMe, but maybe not so different as you go into things like college education. So how are you thinking about that product roadmap and those kinds of offerings for both the folks setting up the GoFundMes and the contributors?
We are, that's a good question. We are definitely thinking about that. And I hope that we'll be able to have some element of recurring in the not too distant future. Because I do think that there's a really important place for that, for us to be able to offer that for, as you say, certain kinds of campaigns. So definitely want to get that sorted out. There's some meat and potatoes even before that. But one of the things we recently did, we're very grateful to be able to do it, is put PayPal on as a payment option. So that's sort of an example of like that really helps a lot of campaigns, because it just opens up a set of people who are more comfortable giving in that fashion. But recurring will be another nice piece of the puzzle for sure. Absolutely. And will allow us to support an even broader set of scenarios that I think will open more doors for folks. So yeah, 100%.
You talked about coming up through product management. Is that the area that you functionally dive into the most? I typically find that, CEOs, especially as companies get bigger and bigger, still pick that one area, whether it's sales or marketing or product, that, they want to be able to dive in a bit more and influence. Is it product for you at GoFundMe, or is it other areas that you find yourself?
I think that's probably right. I mean, if I look at how I draft and think about strategy, it tends to be primarily driven by product strategy, which makes sense in this kind of company, right? Is that we're building a platform for a community of users, and it's all about how do we make it as easy as possible to ask for help? How do we make it safe, secure, and efficient to get the money? And a lot of those are product components, and there's a lot of fascinating kind of user experience questions, because in our business, we are really dealing with human emotion and social psychology, and asking for help is hard. None of us really like asking for help. Asking for help in public is even harder. That's what people are doing on GoFundMe. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we make that more accessible through product design. And we look at things like Airbnb or Uber. 10, 12 years ago, the idea that you would let a room in your house or your apartment to a stranger for a night was like, what? A lot of people are like, I don't think so. Or that you would get in your personal car and pick someone up, some stranger outside a nightclub at 2:30 in downtown LA. Yeah, not so much. Well, those things have been normalized, right? And a lot of that comes to design and building trust and so on. And so, we think about those things in somewhat similar ways. Of course, we're working on something different, which is making it easier to ask for help.
One of the things I've
So
always
yeah, product cuts through is kind of, if you like, product is the tree trunk, right? And then all the other pieces come off of that, essentially.
Yeah. So, I've basically run for the past, 15 years, user-generated content platforms. Obviously today at Comparably, it's employees and now customers that go and contribute feedback about their organizations and the brands they love. Before this, it was a company DocStock, whereas user-generated content of documents. And so there's this balance that is the platform, you set it up for other people to share content, but there's still a certain responsibility around that. I always think for you all, how do you make sure that, how do you deal with fraud around, there are going to be some bad actors out there that try to abuse any platform. Obviously the advantage that you have is that so many times you have a personal connection to the person that set up the GoFundMe. So it, you can trust it. But how do you all think of yourselves as, what do you do when there might be a campaign that someone set up with malicious intent? That's got to be a tricky situation.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, we obviously think about a tremendous amount. So a few things that you hit on, one of them, which is this is first and foremost it's a social product, right? So when you make an appeal to raise money, the first thing you do is you ask for help from the people you know, right? Very few fundraisers get traction without some initial set of donors, and almost universally that initial set of donors are people who know that the person is going to raise money for themselves or for someone else or for some of the cause. And so the social aspect of it, the community, is a really, really important part of making sure that things like misuse don't happen. And I'll give you a stupid example. Let's say I say, I want to raise some money. I've broken my leg. I'm going to put up a fundraiser. Well, my friends and family are like, Tim hasn't broken his leg. He was just running this morning. Like, what are you talking about? So we get those reports and it's like, Tim's full of it. Like, he hasn't broken his leg at all. We investigate that and we deal with it. So the community element and the signal that we receive from that is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, and it's sort of common sense if you think about it. But then underneath that, we also have a lot of technology that is looking for certain patterns, certain triggers, certain signals, and we have 10 years of experience doing this, right? We've had $15 billion flow through the platform. So we've kind of seen most things. And so we know those patterns. And then we have a very extensive and experienced trust and safety team. It's about a quarter of the company works on making sure what we have and the way people are representing things is truthful and accurate. And it's safe for people to give. And constantly earning and re-earning that trust is very, very important to us. And then we have a backstop, which is called the GoFundMe guarantee, which says for any personal campaign, if there is ultimately a problem and all those systems and checks and balances and community involvement for whatever didn't work, we'll make you completely whole. Now, the incidence with which we actually have to invoke the GoFundMe guarantee is about 10 basis points, so 0.1%. And look, no system is perfect. There is no system that's perfect, but it's a good system. It's one that we're continuing to evolve, and we take that responsibility of keeping our community safe, secure, and keeping their trust so they can give and help people. It's a top priority for us. So that's how we think about it.
Yeah, it's amazing what you put in place there. All right, you have a topic that you brought up that I think is really beautiful, which is, you talked about it. It's difficult for CEOs and leaders to ask for help, right? And how do you do that? And so I want to get your thoughts and perspective on why you think that's so important for someone in the CEO spot to do that, and then how do you do it? How do you go about doing it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the short answer is you can't do it alone, right? There's not a lot of successful CEOs who have a team of one, right? And so when you're hiring people, what you're actually doing is you're asking for their help, right? You're saying, and we don't normally think of it that way, but that is what we're doing. We're saying, hey, I have this thing in my company. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's front end coding. I need your help, right? We're trying to do this, and I need this piece of what we're trying to do is a gap. I need you to help me realize this. And so if you kind of just adjust your mindset a little bit, that is what you're doing. And then you extend that into normal operating, where you're saying, hey, we have a special project and we want to get it off the ground and we need 3 people to work on it, one from product, one from tech, one from marketing. Go to them, I need you to work on that project. What are you really doing? You're asking for their help, right? And so it's thinking that way through it, I think is really important. And then, so that's kind of on the operating side, that's recruiting and that's how you staff projects. But then there's also your board and who's around the company. That's also real important because who you put around the company can provide really, really valuable perspective and advice, and also help you avoid pitfalls, right? They can help you sort of like you're going down one track and they're like, well, I've seen that something like that 3 times before. You might want to think about going like this way to avoid the pitfall. And that can save you so much time, so much wasted energy, so much money, and so much opportunity cost. So there, in terms of thinking about those, you're thinking about, okay, what is it I need help on? And what's the matching to that? What am I looking for? I'm looking for someone who has the abilities that can help me with that. But I'm also looking for someone who's going to be motivated inherently by what it is that I'm asking them to help on. Are they going to find it interesting? Are they find it rewarding? Are they going to connect that to the higher purpose? How do I connect all those dots to make a hire or to staff a project or to bring in a board director or an advisor? So those are a few of the themes that I try and think about when you're putting these things together.
Yeah. And you've got this concept about listening, writing, and co-editing. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this goes a little bit to my obsession with Google Docs, which is, my technique tends to be, if I'm trying to think through, say, a strategic element, I will listen a lot, try and learn as much as I can, and then I will sort of take it upon myself to synthesize that and take a first crack at writing down, what do I think this means? What are we going to try and do and why? And sort of create a straw man of that, right? Like, hey, here's a first crack, and then I'll share it with the appropriate group of people and like pound on it, like rip it up, correct it, revise it, tweak it, and then together, let's mold that into something that we think this is good. This is what, our shared mind together thinks is the right thing to do. And I think, there's a few important pieces there. There's making sure that you are listening. There's doing some of the work, right? I like to try and do some of that work myself. There are different styles. Some folks like other people to do that for them and to react. I like to take that initiative and do that, and then get other people to pile in. I think one of the important things there is really being clear that you really do want them to pile in, and that you're not sort of asking but don't really want it. You're not being polite, like, yes, help me, but don't really say anything critical. So no, if you think I've made an assumption here that's wrong, tell me it's wrong. Let's fix it. That's my little bit of ego loss that, I made a mistake or I misperceived something, is far less than actually continuing down this path based on a false premise, right? That's way worse. So it's classic, it's critical thinking in a group environment and using new tools to do a very ancient thing, which is critical thinking.
Can you give an example of a decision or a process that you were going through where you used listening, writing, and co-editing?
Oh my God, yeah. I mean, I'm doing one right now, which is we're sort of taking stock of our strategy, which was most people, we sort of laid out what do we want to get done in 2021. We're just over halfway through. Some things have worked great, some haven't, and the world continues to change. We're like, okay, let's sort of absorb that and reflect, okay, what is it we want to be doing through not just the second part of this year, but into 2022 and beyond? How do we want to adjust our strategy? So I've been doing exactly what we just talked about, right? I took a crack, it's like a 4 or 5 page doc, and I've got a few of my colleagues just pounding away on it, and we're going to craft it, and then we're going to expand the circle, we're going to craft it some more, and hopefully, in about a month, we'll be like, we're feeling pretty good about that. Right now, let's just lock in on that and off we go. So that's great. It's good. And with a good group of people, all of whom share the same purpose, but bring different skills and different expertise to bear, you get a good work product because you're kind of bringing together all those different strengths in one place.
We've both talked about hiring now a little bit. One of my favorite things I always want to selfishly know is, what are the interview questions that you ask? Because you have a candidate that's either a direct report for you or you're helping to screen for the company overall. How do you try to assess whether someone's going to be the right fit for GoFundMe?
Sure. Well, I asked some of the normal questions, right? Which is what does someone think they're good at and so on. But a couple that I asked that I ask someone to walk me through a situation where they faced a lot of adversity and what did they learn from it. I think that's a really important to learn that about someone. And so another question I ask that a lot of people don't always love is I ask them, in terms of how you've got ahead in your career, because most people I'm interviewing have already made it a long way in their career. Did you get there because you're smart or that you work hard? And you could only pick one. And I'm really interested to see how they react to that question. And how they sort of, and everyone of course wants to say it's both, right? But I really want to dig into that. And what I'm looking for on the answer varies a little bit by role, but it's a fascinating one to ask.
And where do you find most people answer work ethic or smarts?
I find most people at the end of the day, after a lot of fighting with that one, tend to go with work hard.
And is that because that's what they feel like they're supposed to answer, or do you feel like that's for them their honest truth?
I think it is a little bit of, I think a blend. It's an interesting one. It sort of provokes an interesting conversation, right? Because of course I'm not like totally doctrinaire about it. It's like, okay, well, let's dig into these different elements. And I think another one that I sometimes ask is, when during your career were you most happy, right? What do you look back on that you really felt like you were in flow work, right? Where work didn't feel like work. That's really interesting because then you're like, and what was it about that role that made you feel like that?
Yeah. And one of the things I always find most powerful in interviewing is simply to ask what else. So for example, I'll ask what most people do in some ways, like, tell me the things that when you've gotten feedback in the past with what your managers want you to improve, what's that feedback been? And I find that most candidates are prepared for a on the surface answer, and but after they give that first response, just simply pausing and saying, okay, well, what else? That's when they don't have that, pre-planned response, and you get more to the heart of the matter or truthful conversation, and just being willing to do what, a good journalist might do, which is just ask into the same topic 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
I think is so valuable. And it's not, I don't think it's about trying to catch a candidate unprepared or prove that they're not good. It's just that I find that the interview process is very, it's a lot more of a presentation on both sides than just an honest connection.
Yeah.
And to me, after 20 years of hiring folks, I still don't know how to have an interview on a screen or sit across from the table and figure out who's the best. There's nothing that ever substitutes for saying, hey, let's work together for 30 days. And
Yeah.
whenever there's opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interviewing, I mean, we talked about it earlier on, like our way of matching people's talent to the opportunities is pretty bad, right? The way we do that in our world, it's just not an effective matchmaking system. And interviewing it's a very superficial and crude sort of a way to evaluate. There's just so much more depth to get into. So I do tend to lean very heavily on detailed conversations with people who've worked with that person. This is just, to your point, nothing beats that, right? And then kind of connecting the dots, see if the pattern connects with things the person has told you. And if the pattern's good and tight, then he's probably, fits together. And if there's these gaps, then you got to drill a bunch more.
Yeah. All right. Well, I know we have time for just a bit more here. One of the things I wanted to make sure to ask is, who are the leaders that you've learned the most from, and what are those leadership lessons that you might still be applying and using today?
I learned a lot from a gentleman called Jeff Weiner, who ran my division at Yahoo and then went on to run LinkedIn and take it on a very successful journey, and probably the smartest person I've ever worked with. Very driven, a savant with numbers, and learned a lot of things from him. One really sort of key one was he had a saying that he'd taken from a famous basketball coach. I think I don't remember who it was, which was next play. So whatever happens, good or bad, good you celebrate, bad you do a postmortem, but you move on, next play. I think he's actually, as Jeff's named his venture, his personal venture arm, Next Play Ventures, I think. But I think that's a useful thing, which is, don't wallow too much, right? Just keep cranking. There's always more to do, and don't get too excited about the successes. Don't get too depressed about the failures. You just got to keep going. So I think that's definitely pretty valuable insight there.
Yeah. And as you think about the next 5-10 years for GoFundMe, and I think you gave this beautiful advice of what CEOs do is paint a picture of a future vision that gets lots of people excited. Mm-hmm. So what's your future vision of what GoFundMe looks like 5 years from today, 10 years from today?
Oh my God. I mean, I really, hope that we can be playing a much broader role in helping people realize, fulfill their needs, realize their dreams, and really help people to move through everyday life. And I think the fundamental human truth is everybody needs help, and everybody likes to give help. And truly, I believe that. Everybody, I mean, I'll give you the extreme example. Like when we are born, we need help. There is no human on earth who has got through life without help. And same at the beginning of your life, often in other parts of your life, certainly at the end of your life. So people need help, both with the tough things and the good things. And there is nothing better than having a group of people around you, whether it be family, friends, or community, helping you achieve that. And I think we have a unique opportunity and a privilege to be a company that can help connect those dots for folks around the world. And I think that would be a wonderful thing to do. So that's what we're trying to do. And we're on the way, but lots more to do to kind of fully fulfill that vision.
Well, I'll tell you, obviously, there's no time in history where folks aren't going through a difficult time or there's stuff going on. And obviously it feels more pronounced for so many folks right now for lots of different reasons. And I think what you all are doing is just a company that's so amazing. I got to imagine that every single person working for you is so proud to be there. They're obviously very lucky to have you at the helm here as an incredibly thoughtful leader. So I think you're going to find the right balance of being reasonably unreasonable here for this organization. And I know I'm really excited to see how the platform continues evolves. And I'm going to be actively searching out more GoFundMe campaigns that, I can contribute to. And thank you for all that you and your team are doing to help so many millions of people all around the world. And, there's a lot of us that are going to be continuing to root you on for your success in every way possible. And thank you so much for your generosity, for your wisdom, and your thoughtfulness today, Tim. It was a real pleasure getting to spend some time here with you.
It's a privilege, and it's a privilege to work at a company like this. So, I think we look at it that way, and it's about how do we honor that privilege, right? To make sure that we do everything we can to fulfill our potential, help people out. So thanks. It was fun talking to you. I hope there's some nuggets in here that can be useful for someone, and fingers crossed. Thanks so much.
Yeah, well, there was a fantastic amount of information. Thank you all for joining us again. We're excited to have you keep coming back to the series that we do here in combination with Entrepreneur Media and Uncomparably. We're going to continue to have amazing guests like Tim. So thank you. Stay safe. Good luck in all of your professional endeavors, and we'll be here hopefully as part of your journey, helping you out with more of these leadership lessons. See you, everybody.
All right. Cheers. Bye-bye.